Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society. We come to you from the ancestral lands of the Nipmuc tribal community, a community that continues to thrive here in central Massachusetts. I'm Kevin Wisniewski, Director of Book History here at AAS, and tonight I am hosting Neal Asbury and Jean-Pierre Isbouts in a discussion of their new book, Mapping America, the incredible story and stunning hand-colored maps and engravings that created the United States. I'm also joined here tonight by AAS Library Assistant Amanda Kondak, who in a few moments will introduce key features to tonight's platform. Before introducing today's guests, I would like to briefly introduce the Society for newcomers. Located in Worcester, Massachusetts, AAS was founded in 1812 by Patriot printer Isaiah Thomas. We are a research library and learned society devoted to understanding and sharing the history and culture of North America before the 20th century. As a library, we collect, preserve, and share the printed record of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts. In addition to this virtual book talk series, we have a variety of public programs. We offer visiting research fellowships, and we welcome scholars and readers from around the world to use our reading room to work on their own research projects. Before I introduce today's guests, I would like to call Amanda out, who will offer a quick overview on the platform we're using today. Amanda.
Thank you, Kevin. Yep, thank you. And good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I have just a few notes about how we'll be using the Zoom webinar format tonight. So for the Q&A portion of the program, we'll be using the Q&A function located on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we will not be using the chat function. By using the Q&A function, we'll be able to keep track of your questions. It also has an upvote option, so if someone posts a question you want to see discussed, be sure to click the thumbs up icon to get it to the top of the queue. You can also place your questions into the Q&A function at any point during the presentation. And due to the large number of attendees, the chat box will only be used for informational purposes. So throughout the program, I'll be posting relevant links and information there. If you have any technical difficulties, you can also message us directly through the chat. If you would like to save the chat to retain the links for future use, you can save the transcription of it by clicking on the three dots in the chat box window. And finally, we are recording this program and we'll make it available on our website and our YouTube channel for reviewing later. So thank you, Kevin. I'll put it back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Amanda. And now I'd like to call on our guests today to turn on their video and audio as I introduce them. First, we have Neal Asbury, who is a global entrepreneur, chief executive of the Legacy Companies, and the host of the nationally syndicated weekly radio show, Neal Asbury's Made in America, produced by Radio America. He's a frequent guest on CNBC, Fox News, MSNBC, and the BBC. And he's published more than 200 articles on global trade issues and is the author of Conscientious Equity, an American entrepreneur's solutions to the world's greatest problems. Asbury has received the President's E-Star Export Award and the Export Achievement Award from the U.S. Department of Commerce, and was the 2008 recipient of the United States National Champion Exporter of the Year Award. And he comes from us from Weston, Florida. Jean-Pierre Isbouts is a historian, doctoral professor at Fielding Graduate University, and the author of 10 books, including The Biblical World, In the Footsteps of Jesus, and The Story of Christianity, which have together sold nearly 2 million copies, as well as The Da Vinci Legacy and The Dali Legacy. Dr. Isbouts, has been on numerous radio and television shows and is the host of the TV series In Search of Masterpieces. He has directed several programs for Disney, ABC, Hallmark, and the History Channel, working with actors such as Leonard Nimoy, Charlton Heston, Dick Van Dyke, and Morgan Freeman, and produced recordings with orchestras from around the world. And he comes from us today from Santa Monica, California. So, gentlemen, I will turn things over to you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Amanda. And for those of you who decided to join us today, 7 o'clock on the East Coast, 4 o'clock on a very, very hot West Coast, you're probably wondering why a book about maps of America? Why a book about the incredible story, as the subtitle goes, of the origins of America, of the birth of America? Haven't we heard that story many times before in school and ever since, and documentaries on History Channel and all sorts of books and articles that continue to be written about our origins? Well, the answer is the story has been told many times, but one vital aspect of that story has always been missing. And that aspect is the first mass medium in human history, which was the copper engraved and the woodblock engraved map. Long before there was footage, film footage, photography, any other form of mass communications that we have today, there was one other medium that allowed people around the world to imagine worlds beyond the horizon, and that was the map, the hand-colored map, and the beauty of that map. And very surprisingly, many historians, my peers, have always ignored maps in telling the story of the birth of America. And so I was so fortunate to be introduced to Neal, who is probably the leading private collector of historical maps of America and the United States in the country. He has an amazing collection. And when the two of us got together, we decided to write a book, Mapping America, that tells the story of our shared origins through the unique lens of these beautiful maps. I'm going to share my screen now because, of course, we can talk about maps, but it doesn't really mean much until you actually see what we're talking about. So this is where our story begins. And at this point, I'd like to hand it over to my partner in crime, Neal, to tell us a little bit why this beautiful map that you see on your screen right now is the beginning of our story.
Well, this is like you said, a beautiful map published in 1482. But the fascinating thing about this cartography is Ptolemy, who is the cartographer, who actually this information came from, lived in the 2nd century. He developed a series of coordinates in a grid that was able, in mathematical terms, he could identify all known lands through this amazing work that he did at the time. So this is pre-Columbus, obviously. Columbus had not yet sailed. This is a world is flat map. But again, the fascinating thing is that this information actually originated in the 2nd century. Claudius Ptolemy was a Roman citizen, and he worked out of the city of Alexandria. And his work became very popular in the late Middle Ages, in the late 1400s, and it started to be engraved. And in Italy and then in Germany, his work became very popular. In fact, the great cartographers of the Renaissance, many of the early cartographers of the Renaissance, like Gerhard Mercator, like Waldseemüller, so many of the early cartographers copied his work and engraved his work, first in woodblock engravings, and then as the technology shifted in the early 1500s to copper engravings. So what happened in this period from the 2nd century until the late 15th century? The fact is that very little happened in cartography. And the information that was best known at the time actually was several hundred years old. But this started it all. This started the sort of human interest, the human thirst to reach beyond the horizons, to discover new lands. What were they actually looking at the time? What would have Columbus been looking at? What was the world that Columbus was looking at before his historic voyage? And Amerigo Vespucci after him, what were they imagining at the time? And so this is where the story starts, right? Because before there was a new world, this was the world that existed. And it's beautifully engraved here and shown in this work of 1482, but from a cartographer who actually lived in the 2nd century.
And so when we go on, and one point that we make in the book is that the birth and formation of the United States was actually the outcome of ideals about human rights, about human enlightenment, that began with the Renaissance. We really believe that the formation of the United States is the direct output of ideas that were first formulated in the early 15th century in Florence, which, as you know, was the birthplace of the Renaissance. Now, of course, the Renaissance goes back earlier than that. Dante, Petrarch, these were people who began in the 14th century to write sonnets and stories in the form of Roman literary formats, which is already very scary. You had to be careful because you could wind up at the stake as a heretic. And then in the early 15th century, something amazing happened. The Duomo, the Church of the Cathedral of Florence, issued a competition to create new panels for the doors of the baptisterium. And what happened is that two of the leading competitors, Ghiberti and Brunelleschi, both submitted a competitive design that quoted pagan sculpture, such as this figure here on the bottom, the Spinario. And now at any other time, they would have been dragged off to the stake, extra crispy, please, and burnt there. But for the first time, the church accepted it, at least the church in Florence. And at that point, the floodgates were open, and all these ideas about seeing the world on our own terms, not restricted by church doctrine, but as it was, based on exploration, based on science, based on reasoning. Those doors were thrown wide open, and that produced an incredible book that Neal is going to talk to you about right now, which is really the first marker in our story, which is the Nuremberg Chronicle. Neal?
This is an amazing work, and in fact, I happen to have it here. Here it is. Here's the Chronicle. I mean, someone told me the other day when we were presenting that this looked like it came from Harry Potter. I mean, it's just an incredible work. You can see the spine here. I mean, how thick this was. This was published in 1493 and actually in Nuremberg by a humanist, a very well-known humanist who collected all sorts of documents. He really, the humanists really thirst for knowledge, and that was really a key moment in human history. Is this knowledge and gathering knowledge. And the humanists believe that it was a civic duty. It was your responsibility as a citizen to educate yourself. And so the Hartmann Schedel, who was the publisher of the Chronicle, set out on this incredible work. There is 1,800 woodblock engravings in the Chronicle. It's the first time where you have the printed word and images on a piece of paper for the first time. It's the first time that we see actually the images of towns and cities. Before they would be talked about, but it wasn't like all together and put together and chronicled in one place where you could see London and Paris, you could see Rome, you could see Constantinople. You could see these places that people could only imagine, and you could read about them. Now, they all look the same. Obviously, there was no photography. There was nothing to reference. The people engraving had never been to these places. It was all hearsay, and the information that they got was just the word of mouth. There was nothing to reference. But still, at the time, it was absolutely incredible. Just the work itself, to be able to get this amount of paper to print on, So many different suppliers of paper had to be called in. The inks and everything that was required to produce this in the quantities that they produced, even though it was very limited, but for the time, it was one of the massive undertakings of publishing to put this chronicle together. It starts with the Old Testament and literally goes to the Old Testament, the New Testament, and then it connects, to the late of 1400s. And fascinating is there's 3 blank pages at the end of the chronicle, and that's where the world would end. So there was 3 pages left, and whoever owned the chronicle would need to fill out those pages so it would be complete with the end of the world. So we talk about this end of the world, the doomsday preppers, and all of that, and we think that that's something that just occurred. No, this has been around since the late Middle Ages, the end of the world. But what it did, it connected knowledge and the thirst for knowledge together with a strong human body as the way to enter heaven. So it was gathering knowledge, reaching out into the world, going out into the unknown, educating yourself. That was the spark of the Renaissance and the age of discovery. So a very pivotal time in human history.
And that brings us to a very important map. As you saw on the previous slide, the printing press, of course, was what made all this possible. The printing press is the most important revolutionary technology ever in the history of humankind. Before that, knowledge was limited to the elites, the aristocracy, the church. But the printing press, basically anyone could suddenly become learned about topics. And the maps, of course, were a key outcome of that. And up to this point, people thought there were 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. And in this map by Waldseemüller, for the first time, another continent is added. Neal, what was this continent called?
Well, this is America. And so we're all Americans. So what is the reason that we're called Americans? Where did it come from? How did it happen? It wasn't like there was a committee somewhere in Europe that voted on these names, and they had all these names. Oh, well, there's this new continent out there. Let's all take a vote. What are we going to call this? But this map is so important historically, and it's got just such an incredible story behind it. It's a very large map. You can see the different plates in the map, and as you can see the Ptolemy world. The world is flat world, from Africa to Asia. That was what was known prior to the sailing of Columbus. And then you see this continent out to the left is kind of floating out there. But this map was produced in Germany by Martin Waldseemüller, an important cartographer of the day. Again, a very big student of Ptolemy, who we seen his work just recently in a previous slide. And he had got hold of the Vespucci letters. Columbus had, we all know that Columbus had sailed. He had reached what is today the Dominican Republic, and he thought he had reached Asia, and he was in some part of Asia. He was replaced by Amerigo Vespucci. He made 2 sailings in 1501 and 1502, and he determined that he had reached a new world and that this continent was surrounded. It was a distinct land. He called it a distinct land that was surrounded by 4 oceans. And he had sailed down the coast of South America, and he had kept notes and his observations. And these were turned into what was called the Vespucci letters. And Waldseemüller got a copy of the Vespucci letters, and he was very enthralled by it. And so in honor of Vespucci, he engraved this new continent into the world map to bring current the Ptolemy map. And over what is now South America, he engraved the word America. And that is the first time ever that the word America was used to describe this new continent, this new world. Now, this map was rumored to exist, and it was written about, but no one had ever seen it. It was rumored to exist, but no one had ever seen it. And throughout history, everybody had been searching. This was the holy grail of maps. In 1901, it was finally discovered in a castle in Germany. And so the Waldseemüller map of 1507 was actually real. It existed. And there was one copy that was ever found, and that was in a castle in Germany. And after about 100 years, and I believe it was 2006, that in an agreement with the castle owner and the government of Germany, the map was transferred to the United States, and it's now in the Library of Congress, the one copy. And so this is where we all got our name. We're Americans. We're very proud Americans. And this is where it all began, in this map that you see before you right now.
And of course, America is the Latinized version of Vespucci's first name, Amerigo. Amerigo Vespucci became America. Then the conquistadores followed in his footsteps and settled and began to conquer Latin America, of course. And they also set foot on the south of America, North America itself, and they called it La Florida. This is a beautiful map by the Spanish cartographer Jerónimo Chiaves. And you can see that La Florida was originally not just our panhandle, our Florida, but much of the south of North America as well, even though the Spanish didn't really invest in developing this country. They just had various missions, various settlements, and focused on trade. And the reason when they discovered that there was no silver and gold to be had in North America, they then focused most of their activity on Latin America. I'm going to move ahead, Neal, because just in the interest of time, but tell us a little bit about this beautiful map, because this shows us how the Spanish slowly conquered the hinterlands of Latin America in their search for silver and gold.
Actually, I mean, this map is absolutely beautiful. And there's just so much going on here. First of all, it was a wall map. It was a very large map. It was made out of 6 sheets. So it really showed, of a work of this size, to show how important the Americas were. And, because it was a very important part of the world, and there was all of this activity in Europe and thought going into this and the riches of the New World, a very large scale piece was developed and created, and you see it before you. Like we said, the Waldseemüller map you saw was also a large scale work, but that was a world map, not just dedicated on the Americas. And now the Waldseemüller map was 1507. The map that Jean-Pierre just showed you, or the naming of Florida, I should say, was 1513. And then you come to 1562. Another important thing is the naming of California. The first time that the word California is used is in this map in 1562. But in this map, you see South America is at the center. And as Jean-Pierre said, the fascination with the New World was really South America. The gold and the silver and the riches. In North America, it was kind of like there was not a lot of attention. There was not a lot of interest in North America. And you can see by this map how South America is really where the focus was. You see all of these images on the map. And I think it's very important in early cartography that you see what's going on. Vespucci wrote about cannibalism along the South American coast. And you see here actually a depiction of cannibalism in what today would be Brazil. And that was repeated over and over and over again in early cartography. They were absolutely fascinated by cannibalism in South America, and you see it engraved in these images. You see a volcano exploding in Mexico. You see all of these sea creatures, and those sea creatures aren't there just for decoration. They were there as a warning. Anybody who would go to these faraway lands would have to contend with these sea monsters that would just come out of the sea and they would devour your ship. I mean, these images were real. This was not an imagination. This was not a fantasy. This was absolutely what was going on in the risk that you were taking. Remember, these are the first images. There was no photography And you talk about, we talk about maps and you think about geography. You think about geography, they just show places, and they show, in a two-dimensional form, they show how to move from one place to another. But no, early cartography was also the photography. It was the photo record. It was the images that came out of these lands. How did they dress? What did they eat? What did they do? You see all of these interesting animals and creatures. So there's just so much going on here, and so much information in the early Renaissance is being conveyed in this map and others of the period.
And of course, we must, here's another depiction from the time of the natives. And of course, we acknowledge in the book that a lot of the pre-Columbian civilizations, the Maya, the Inca, the Aztec, were beautiful civilizations that had developed cities and literature and art long before some of the countries in Europe were destroyed in this process. Not so much because of conquest by the sword, but because the conquistadores introduced diseases, pandemics, something that we're very familiar with today, such as the smallpox. And so in some cases, 80 to 90% of these populations died because of these terrible diseases that were introduced. But then North America, sort of the attention shifted to North America when the Dutch came into play. And the Dutch, it was actually a very small country, the 7 provinces of Holland, which had broken away from the Spanish Empire and promptly became Protestant, Calvinist rather than Catholic. And so developed their own very unique culture as merchants, as tradesmen. But in the process, they also developed a whole new form of ship called a flight. It was a large ship that dispensed with all sorts of armaments, like the Portuguese and the Spanish were still doing, in order to maximize its cargo space. In the book, we call it the jumbo jet of the 17th century. And because of this new technological breakthrough, the Dutch were able to chart routes not only to the Indies and igniting the spice race, but also to North America. And Neal, tell us about this fascinating, these cartouches here of this tiny little village. What is that village called?
Well, that's New Amsterdam.
That's right.
That's New Amsterdam, and the area is New Belgica and the New England, or what we would call New England today. This was the Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam and the surrounding areas. As I say, well, first of all, we have to recognize the Dutch and how important they were in the Renaissance, and especially in the early exploration of North America, which would become our country, and how important they were to that. The Dutch cartography of the 1600s, the golden age of cartography, centered around Amsterdam, and this is a beautiful example of that. How colorful it is, how vibrant it is. The technology in engraving, as we've seen in these early maps, were woodblock engraving. So you couldn't really engrave very fine lines and these beautiful images and so forth. But in the early to mid 1500s, the technology shift to copper engravings, to where you could really the imagery that you can make and the fine lines in the way that you would identify places in the writing that you could do on a map. It just became so much better, so much nicer. You can convey so much more information. And you see, this is really at the height of Dutch cartography. You see this beautiful map, but historically, it's also incredibly important. What you see is the village of New Amsterdam, which would become New York City, of course. That is the very first image of New York. That's the very first image of New York City. So as these maps, as you can see, so important. So it's not just a map, but it's the imagery that was coming with that map. So the Dutch knew that they had to settle this land, and this was a very vast land. So they had to get their citizenry interested to make that journey to this new world. And what were they going to do once they got there? What were they going to eat when they got there? Was this land bountiful and plentiful? So these maps also provided great information so the Dutch government can promote to its people this is a great place to go. Look at all these animals and look at these places and these villages that exist over there, and that this is a rich land, and this is a place that you should consider bringing your family and establishing yourself. So much was going on here. And a second view of New York also appeared on this map that was updated about 25 years after this map was produced. This was circa 1650. So in the 1672, an upgraded version of this map shows a second view of New Amsterdam, which actually shows Wall Street as a wall. And it's the only image of Wall Street as a wall. So you could see how important that these maps were in conveying all kinds of information for all kinds of purposes. But you can also see how they were also articles of art. I mean, this is beautiful. The way they were produced, the way they look, the way they were colored. This is art at its best as well.
And of course, then the story continues, because then the English come, and the English give the Dutch an offer they can't refuse. The Dutch realized that with a tiny country, they were never going to populate this vast continent. But the English belatedly recognized that they had to catch up on the Spanish and the Portuguese. And so then the English come in, they begin to settle the eastern seaboard. They acquire Manhattan or Manhattan from the Dutch. The Dutch didn't care as long as they could live, practice their faith, of course, in peace, but also trade in peace. They weren't necessarily interested in the political building of an empire. And so what you see here is one of the first maps of North America as shown by the British point of view. And the point that we try to make here is that unlike the Spanish and the Portuguese, the English really meant to settle this land, to build villages that became towns and became cities. And of course, it's very different from the maps that we just saw before, right, Neal?
Yeah, and it's fascinating. You think about the British and the Empire and so forth, and all of their world possessions. But they were really very far behind in cartography. I mean, the Dutch were just so much more advanced. And for that matter, so were the Germans and the French. And you take a look at this English work. Well, of course, once they acquired New Belgica and they acquired New Amsterdam, they had to rename it. And so this is one of the earliest maps to actually show the renaming of the Dutch possessions, or what they acquired from the Dutch, to the English names. So this is at that pivotal point in history to where the British became the dominant players on the eastern seaboard of North America. But of course, the French were not far away, as we'll find out here very, very soon.
Yeah, that's
but
right.
This map shows the British now taking a really major interest in North America.
And exactly that, to follow up on what Neal said, the French had settled the North, Canada, and parts of North America, and were starting to catch up as well. They saw the incredible opportunity to broaden their possessions and all of the richness that would bring to their own treasury, but also in the constant race with other powers in Europe. And so slowly but surely, the tensions escalated between the British and the French, and the people caught in between were the indigenous tribes, the American Indians, because they, of course, were the primary purveyors of what these settlers were after, such as fur. And so you see that both the French and the British tried to create alliances with the local tribes, which would then ultimately provoke the French-Indian War. But there is a wonderful picture here on this map. Neal, tell us a little bit about these people that we see here.
Well, this is a very beautiful map, and as I was collecting maps, and my young daughters would see what I was doing, they would always ask me to show them this map. This is the map. Really, it exists. The story really did happen. Of course, it was embellished upon, but this is the John Smith and Pocahontas story. John Smith was sent to Jamestown in 1606 to establish a colony and to map the Chesapeake. And shortly after arriving, he was out doing his work. And, he used very primitive tools. A lot of it was by sight. A lot of it was by interviewing the Native American tribes that lived in that area and just gathering information by talking to the Native Americans. Very primitive tools. So it's amazing, that the accuracy that they could come up with what they were working with is truly amazing. But he was captured by Pocahontas's brother, and he was taken back, and he was condemned to death. And Pocahontas pleaded with her father to please spare him. And the rest is history, as we know. And who knows what was real and not real. But this is actually the map that John Smith had drawn. He drew it in manuscript. It was sent back to England and ultimately also to Amsterdam, and then it was engraved into copper. And then it was, it was distributed from there. I mean, limited copies, but nonetheless, that we could actually see the John Smith and what his work was and what he was doing when he was there during the period of the early 1600s. In fact, that image up to the upper left is an image of the Powhatan Indian Council. And it's actually an image that was sketched by John Smith. And so the cartouche work, again, is incredibly important. And over 200 Native American names of towns exist on this map. And many of those same names are used today. So this is really historic. And especially if you live in the Chesapeake area, this map is hugely important because of the historic significance, but also the naming of the towns still live on today from the time of John Smith.
That's just so incredible. We have 10 minutes left, so we're going to move a little faster. We're now entering the era of the Revolutionary War. And in our book, we talk at length about what sparked the Revolutionary War. I mean, just a few decades earlier, the British had rushed to the aid of the English colonists to suppress the French in the French Indian War. So there was tremendous amount of solidarity and gratitude from the English colonists towards the mother country, towards the British Crown. So why then, just a few decades later, were they at loggerheads, and did the colonists actually rose in rebellion? Well, we don't really have the time to talk about it, but it goes well beyond the Boston Tea Party. Let's put it that way. But Neal is going to tell you why this Mitchell map is so important. And I love the way, Neal, you tell the story. So please go ahead.
Well, this is actually started a war and it ended a war. And in American history, the Wassermuller map would have to be right up there as far as the Americas. But for the United States, this map has to be the most important map. Well, first of all, let's talk about it. It was first published in 1755, and this is the French version of the map. And because it became such a contentious, controversial map, Mitchell, who he was a physician, he only visited North America once. But anyway, the work that he did and the cartography that he did lived on forever, and it lives on until today, actually, in creating the United States. But he showed in 1755, when he published this, the English settlements, fortresses, factories, economic interests extending from the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio Valley. And that was an area that the French had claimed. And the way that these empires would kind of put each on notice was producing maps. The royal cartographers producing maps, the cartographers of their countries producing maps showing what their possessions were. And here was an English cartographer showing English possessions within the French territory in 1755. And shortly after that, because of the clash of these two empires happening in the Ohio Valley, we have the French Indian War. Obviously, the French were humiliated. They lost. It ended in 1763. In Europe, it's called the 7-Year War. Here we call it the French Indian War. But that was really the start of the Revolutionary War. The retribution that the French felt towards the British, that they needed to settle score, would actually be pivotal in the Revolutionary War itself. But in the time that we have here, the French Indian War in what happened in that period of time could really be seen on this Mitchell map, and then the republishing of the map by the French, showing all of those English settlements being eliminated and being converted back to French. So how these empires would fight through maps and was absolutely incredible. And this is like one of the greatest examples. Now, speed up to 1783. There was a Treaty of Paris and Versailles that actually created the United States. And it is a copy of the Mitchell map that you see here that was laid out on a table in Versailles, and they took a marker and they drew on that map the boundaries of what would become the United States. And that map is also in the Library of Congress, is the treaty that created the United States. The treaty map of the United States is actually the Mitchell map that they used as well. So you can see how in American history, how incredibly important this is. And until today, land disputes between Canada and the United States are settled by this map. So very, very important in our history.
And I want to just stress one more thing is that, we wrote the book in a way that is accessible for the general reader. This is not just for cartography specialists. We were very careful to write the book in such a way, in narrative history style, so very immersive style, where hopefully you will get caught up in the drama of the moment. We talk about the lifestyles of the early colonists, the type of furniture they bought, the type of fashion they wore, the type of food they ate. So we really try to sort of go beyond the mere specter of the maps and depict a vision, an idea of what it was like in those years before the Revolutionary War. We have time for 2 or 3 more maps, but Neal, you have to tell us a little bit about this map, because our book includes so-called battle maps, which is an entirely different genre. These were maps, of course, created by British officers on the scene that were then rushed to London for use by the British Crown. Is that true, Neal?
That's true. I mean, these were the real-time sort of newsreels coming from the battlefield, where British officers in manuscript by hand would write what happened on the battlefield, and they would be sent by fast ship back to London, to where they would be engraved, and King George and his court then would be able to follow along with what was happening, kind of in what they would call real time, though there was weeks of a lag. But they played a very, very important role. And in our book, we have several of the battle maps. And for me personally, in my collection, something that I cherish a lot. I have so many beautiful pieces, but the battle maps to me are so fascinating. They show the movement of the troops, the forts. The British are always depicted in red. The Continental Army is always depicted in blue. And in our book, we have several of these: the crossing of the Delaware, the Battle of New York, the Battle of Lake Champlain, the Battle of Saratoga, the Battle of Yorktown, of Lexington, of Concord, and you see these, and you can follow along with them and see exactly what the British officers were seeing, what the American officers were seeing, what the British Crown was seeing, and how their decisions was being was being laid out. It was absolutely phenomenal. In the book, one of my favorite is the French battle plan of Yorktown in the blockading of the York Peninsula. And it was a beautiful piece. Obviously, the French, they were very proud of that. It was very important. And it was a favorite of King Louis XVI. He would hand out copies of that to people who visited him, showing this great victory at Yorktown. And there's actually a copy of that document in the book.
And so we come to the final episodes now. This is the map where for the first time the word, French map, where the first time the words États-Unis appears, the United States. But the proper way to end this talk is with the Mellish map. And this is an incredible story, how already at that early date, the people of the revolution envisioned a manifest destiny for our country. And Neal, tell us, why is the Mellish map so important?
Well, the Mellish map, first of all, everything that we've seen up until this point was European. The discoveries were European. The printing materials were European. The cartography, the engraving was European. And so now you got this beautiful map here in front of you that is produced in America with American discoveries, engraved in America by a very young but very proud American country, this new country that emerged on the world stage. It is the first time that America's borders extend to the Pacific. Now, it was far from certain that this would actually happen because the British and the Spanish also claimed the west coast of the North American continent. But this was a very vibrant new country. It was a very bold new country. It was ready to tell the world that this was our continent and that you needed to be aware. And so much so that this was a favorite of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson loved cartography. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a very famous cartographer. He produced the map on Virginia that was used throughout the Revolutionary War by the British, as well as the Continentals of Virginia. That map was incredibly important. So Thomas Jefferson was always around cartography. But this map was particularly important to him when he was a very famous guy in Europe, and all the dignitaries would want to come out and meet the famous Thomas Jefferson, the signer of the Declaration of Independence, the creator of the American Constitution. They wanted to go and meet this man, and he would love to give this map as a gift, showing that this country was now claiming the entire continent, and you needed to stay away. And that was America's manifest destiny, was to grow from this small little humble beginning to this great nation. It was our destiny. But before we became this great global power, we had to become a power of our own backyard. And that's what our early founders, that's what they set up for us. That was their world that they lived in. Go West, young man. Go West, young man was coined because of this map. We had to populate the West. And so you can't overestimate how important this was in the early American psyche. And so now as America's launched, America is the fulfillment of the promise of the Renaissance. All of these ideals of human freedom, of the freedom of thought, the freedom of trade, the freedom of expression can all be found in the founding of the United States, the American Constitution. Yes, we still had problems and we had things that we needed to resolve, but the genesis was there. The spark was there for America to grow into this great country. And that's why we end the story, because it was the founding of the United States and setting us on course. And as we enter into the period that we're talking about right now, the early 1800s, America was truly on course to become the greatest nation that the world has ever known.
Thank you so much, Neal. And that's our presentation for today. Of course, we want to take some time to answer your questions, but we thought it was particularly relevant to publish the book right now. It will not come as a surprise to you that our nation is divided politically, ideologically. So why not then write a book that sort of tells us all the things that we do agree on, all the things that we do have in common. So we hope that as such, the book will resonate with our audience in the United States and abroad. And with that, we hand it back over to Kevin.
Thank you very much. Thank you both, Neal and Jean-Pierre, for this wonderful presentation. At this time, the Q&A feature is open. I know a few questions have been submitted already, and I welcome those in attendance to submit their questions to the authors. As we wait for more submissions to come, I would like to kind of start things off. I know we have somewhat limited time here, Neal and Jean-Pierre, so I kind of want to just kind of start things off by talking about the beginnings of this book. So first, Neal, I know you're an avid map collector, and we just witnessed a book collector as well. But I'd love to hear how you first became involved in map collecting, what what you collect, how you've narrowed down your collection, and ultimately how that collection really developed into this project.
So just very quickly, as you said, I'm a global trade guy. I lived outside the United States for a good part of my life. I've been promoting American products around the world, and I built a great career out of exporting American products. And as part of that, and when I was in my early 20s, I got a job in Singapore. And when I was in Singapore, my job was traveling the region, the Asia Pacific, the Middle East. And as I was traveling, I was completely fascinated and immersed in these cultures. I read everything I possibly could about these countries I was visiting. And I was reading a book on the Ottoman Empire. And I went into a bookstore in Singapore, and they had an old map of the Ottoman Empire in this store. And it wasn't a particularly important map, and it wasn't very expensive, but it was a map from the period. It was an original map from the period of the Ottoman Empire, and I bought it. And from that, I just became completely immersed in maps and studying maps, and especially old maps. And I built this beautiful collection on Asia. And I started in Asia. So I lived in Asia for a good part of my life. So I have this incredible collection on Asia. But there was a time that it came that I moved back to the United States. And when I came back to the US, I says, now that I got this beautiful Asian collection, now I need to do the same for the United States. And I started collecting in the United States. In fact, Jean-Pierre and I have two more projects. It's a trilogy. It's mapping Asia and mapping the Holy Land. So that's our next two projects. We want to keep this going.
Fantastic. So keep an eye out for those. Absolutely. Jean-Pierre, I wanted to kind of tie you into this question as well, because initially I thought this book seemed like a departure from your work on religion and Christianity and the Renaissance. Although there's that strong tie to the Renaissance throughout the book. I wanted to know how you got involved in this project, and maybe how looking at maps has made you actually reconsider your other works on the Renaissance, perhaps.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I'm a historian, and we are sort of a dying breed in the United States because it's, academically, we're increasingly focused on the STEM sciences. Nothing wrong with that, but we should never forget the arts and the humanities. It is what makes us human. We need to work, but we also need to develop as human beings. And I've always been very fascinated with this time period from the Renaissance to the 19th century. Right now, I'm actually in production on a 15-episode series on the 19th century and specifically the art of Vincent van Gogh. So I tend to go where interests take me. And it was actually my literary agent, Neal's literary manager and good friend, Peter Miller, who introduced us to each other. And when we sort of right away discovered it, we were very, very complementary. I mean, Neal, of course, is the cartography expert par excellence. And I bring sort of a historical perspective to that. So it fit perfectly. And on top of that, I really was very interested in retelling the story of the origins of America, because over time, that story has sometimes been distorted by various political considerations. And really, we never really looked at that from a cultural perspective, and Neal's incredible expertise allowed us to do that. And while I just briefly address some of the questions in the chat box? I know we're running a little short on time.
Absolutely, yeah.
Go
ahead.
A lot of people are intrigued by the access to these things, and I'll give my answer, because this appears time and time again in the chat box. Well, how do people get to these things? And then I'll let Neal talk about it too. As far as I know, a lot of the printing shops were also bookshops. So if you were a printer with a printing press, which is quite a big machine, a large investment, then typically you also had a front store like the Hondius and the Blau cartographers in Amsterdam. In fact, they were right next to each other, where you would go if you wanted to buy something nice for your wife or your husband. You went there, you got a nice big map. And as Neal said earlier, the Dutch artists like Vermeer, you see in his interior paintings that maps were often prominently displayed on the maps by these bourgeois merchants as a conversation piece. not only to show how worldly they were and how educated and how interested they were in lands beyond the horizon, but simply at dinners for the host to stand up and talk about the map in much the same way that we have our own versions of conversation pieces today. So that art shows that these maps were really well spread. Of course, among the well-to-do, I won't say affluent, but let's say the middle class. So access to these maps was remarkably widespread at the time. Would you agree, Neal?
Yeah, I mean, based on the amount of images that they could get from a plate, and depending on how that was going, they would reissue the plate, they would update the plate. And, in today's terms, it was really limited about how many impressions that was in the marketplace, because, once you had steel engravings and then the printing of today, of course, it's unlimited of how many images are out there. But they are accessible. I don't want people to think that map collecting is just something that's like an incredibly expensive hobby to have. I mean, there's beautiful maps from the periods that we've been talking that are not necessarily very expensive. And, there's great map dealers here in the United States that, have offered these. And the biggest map collection, there's a huge map show. And it's one of the biggest in the world. It's every year, but last year they didn't have it, obviously, for the last couple of years because of the pandemic. The Miami Map Fair, which is in Miami, obviously, it's every February. And you can meet all these people and these collectors and these sellers from around the world that has these beautiful historic documents. And some of them, of course, are very expensive, and it depends on what it is that you're looking to collect and what piece of history that sparks your imagination. But there's many that's also very affordable. And I'd like to just say that to everybody, that you can own pieces of history and it doesn't have to be that expensive.
Thank you. I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions here. One of the things that I really admired about your book is its accessibility. I think you wrote this new version of a early American history survey from this perspective of maps. And I love that. And it's really lovely. In popular history books, these stories kind of recount the works of the navigators, the monarchs, the joint stock companies, which do, of course, are characters in your narrative as well. But they don't account for another cast of characters, which I think is very important to your work, which is those printers, artisans, map makers, etc. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about those kinds of people, what that process was like? Because it wasn't just one person, right? Drawing this or sketching out this map. There was a whole team of people. You showed Neal, you showed the Nuremberg Chronicle a moment ago, which already blew my mind there. You surprised me. But there's a whole team of people here that worked on that, from the printing office to the printmakers and illustrators and painters, etc. So could you, I know there's a lot of different varieties of maps in your book, but could you, in the time that we have available, tell us a little bit about, the type of process and the types of people that were involved, as well as the materials and technology that were used?
Yeah, maybe I can start out with that. I mean, first of all, is how did they get the information, which is very fascinating, because the cartographers themselves were not actually going out to get this information. The information would have to come back to them. And in the early maps, a lot of it is hearsay. I mean, you see these big continents and you see all of this places that's in towns and names of places engraved in the middle of these big continents, but they had never yet been explored. I mean, nobody was there. It was like word of mouth. I mean, they would go and they would talk and they would listen, and then they would come back and they would sketch and look, they were using the sight, they were using the stars, they were using a compass, they were using very, very basic instruments. But these ships would get back, and all of these notes and these sketches and this knowledge the great cartographers of the day would get this information, would be there at the docks to get this information and bring it into their studios and really study it and compare it with other cartography and see what's new. Is there something here that has not yet been covered? And that was really like gold for these guys, because if they found, new templates or outlines of continents and islands and lands that had not yet been discovered, and they were the first ones to engrave it. I mean, that was amazing for them, to be the first to create the foundation map, to create the map that everybody else copied. And obviously plagiarism back then was rampant. I mean, it was actually great to be copied. It meant that your thoughts and your ideas were the best of the day. So the more that it was repeated, the more that it became accepted. But then you get into the studio, and then you have engravers. We talk about engraving. Today, copper engraving is an art. Engraving is an art. Woodblock engraving is an art. So to say that these are pieces of art, it's absolutely true. So you had this studios of engravers, and how meticulous that they needed to be to take these plates and to engrave into copper, or before that into wood. And remember, they had to do it in relief. They had to do it backwards, because if they take the plate and press it into paper, to make it read properly, it would have to be in relief. It would have to be backwards. So, and then then the paper itself, just to get the amount of paper that they needed, it wasn't like you went to the store like Office Depot and Office or Staples or one of these places and say, hey, look, I need a few reams of paper. No, just to get the materials was already hard. To get the inks was already hard. And then once they pressed it into paper, then you saw those images, they were hand colored, and they had studios of colorists. And no two maps are really the same, because different colorists would have different styles and different colors and different ways of coloring in these maps. So they are, very unique in that way as well. It's not like they're mass produced. Even though you have the same map, you could see it in many different color schemes, because the people and the artists who were making it were different from map to map, even though it was the same geography coming from the same copper plate. So as you say, it was really, Kevin, a huge production, and lots of people coming from different places of life, different disciplines in life, it took to make one of those images.
We do have another question here, again, regarding moving from making of these maps to dissemination. Ronald Epp here asks, please explain how newly minted maps made their way into the hands of the public.
They would be either sold as individual leaves, and you could buy them as an individual map and an individual leaf, but many times they were compiled into an atlas, into a book. We showed one of the maps earlier from Abraham Ortelius. It was the 1584 map on Florida, the very first map of Florida. Ortelius is credited of producing the very first atlas. But depending on the part of the world that you were interested in, you could actually buy the leaves, and you could buy, you didn't have to buy the whole atlas. You can buy individual copies. And then they were also, the same map could be engraved in 4 or 5 different languages. So you could have a German version, a Dutch version, an English version of the map. And so, the buyers of the maps could buy in the language that they wanted it to be in as well. But now remember, they were expensive, relatively expensive. There was not a lot of copies that were made. I believe a copper plate would give you about 100 impressions before it would have to be reworked. So it wasn't like they were producing thousands of these. And so the people who could afford them was really, quite a subset of the population. The people who could read them, the people who even could understand what was going on, and could buy these as something that would help, with whatever they were thinking or working on. So that's how they were sold. I mean, it wasn't necessarily that you would go to like some bookstore to buy them. You would buy them from the publisher themselves or the map maker themselves.
We have a number of questions here, and I'm afraid we're very limited on time, so this might actually be the last one for the evening, I'm afraid. I'm trying to combine as many as I can into one, so you'll have to bear with me. There's a number of questions from map collectors or potential map collectors and they are asking essentially if you could describe what the rare maps market is like, and what are the best ways to conserve a map collection.
So the map market is very vibrant, and there's a lot of great dealers in the U.S., and a lot of them are my friends. So I don't want to say, this one is the best one or that. There's some really brilliant people who are selling these products and who know so much about them. And they really, to be honest with you, they've really built up really nice businesses because there is a great market. And think about the universities that want this material in their libraries, and corporations, or just people that want them on their walls. I mean, there's just so many people who have become turned on to map collecting, and there's a number of great dealers here in the U.S. and abroad, but here in the U.S. And just Google it. I mean, you'll find and you'll see that there's a lot of great people and choices out there to buy from, and they are accessible. They are accessible. Certain ones are. I mean, certain ones, you'll be shocked sometimes about how much they sell for. But there are a number of maps that are very accessible, and the map dealers here in the United States are very good people. They're very accessible. They're great people to talk to. They really know their stuff, and I think you'll just enjoy just getting to know them. So I would recommend that. As far as preservation, I'm crazy. I built like all these galleries in my home. I have many of them displayed, and I do it all archivally because they're all, original paper, original inks, and this stuff will last for hundreds of years. The type of paper that we mat them on, the type of glass that we use, you don't let UV ray lights and sunlight and all of that. You got to protect them from that. You got to protect them from any acids or anything in the paper. But if you do that, but other people, put them in cabinets, to where there is no light getting to them, and they're putting in sleeves of folders that also are archival, and that it will protect them for the hundreds of years. I mean, this Nuremberg Chronicle, my maps and everything you see, I mean, they will be here for the next 400 or 500 years, for people to enjoy. That's our job, to pass them on, to make sure. I mean, I'm just one person, and how many people own this Nuremberg Chronicle? How many people have opened this? How many people have seen the maps that I own? How many people over the last 400 or 500 years has actually looked and beholden these? And yet they preserve them and pass them on so I could own them. So it's my job now to make sure I do my duty in the short period of time that I own them, so that I can pass them on to the next. I mean, these maps will live much longer than I will. And my duty is just in my short time to make sure that I pass them on so the next generation can enjoy them as much as we do.
Well, that's a beautiful closure, Neal. That's wonderful.
It is indeed. With that, I would like to thank Neal and Jean-Pierre for joining us today. I encourage all those in attendance who would like to learn more to go out and purchase the book. There are links in the chat that you'll find as to where to find that. Also in the chat, you'll find a link to a survey for tonight's program. We would love to hear from you, so please let us know how much you enjoyed it. Our next program will be next Thursday at 2:00. It's a book talk with Billy Coleman on his latest book, Harnessing Harmony, Music, Power, and Politics in the United States, 1788 to 1865. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time. Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay. Bye-bye.